And we are talking tonight on, what is it, Joe?
Strategies for affecting change in perceptions around home education.
Yes, because we come across negative perceptions all the time, and that's part of our problem, part of our battle. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Joe, because she's going to do a presentation to introduce the subject, and then we will have a chat afterwards. So I'm going to mute myself and just bow out and let you get on with it.
Thank you. I think part of the my understanding of this situation actually has come from being at the University of Exeter and engaging and developing some research into home education. And that led to dealing with various government bodies, the Department for Education, Ofqual, and more recently the Safeguarding Panel. And it really did help me realise that there are some really strong perceptions about what home education is. And more interestingly, when I've looked and engaged with researchers worldwide, this is actually common beyond the UK, and the perceptions around home education um, in other countries are quite similar. And some countries actually have gone a few steps ahead of us, where they've actually managed to change the perceptions around home education, where it is seen as something positive and where it's more respected in terms of being seen equally as an equal choice to school. So I think that part of those findings are actually what's informed my talk today. So I'm going to screen share. I know there's been a question in the app already, and I will come to that. But if anybody else has got one, you can pop it either here in the chat or on the Hoover app. Okay. And if you can give me just a nod if you can see the screen share now. Hopefully you can just see one of my screens. Okay. All right. Okay, so a couple of things I'm going to run through today. What other countries have done to promote home education in a more positive way. And I'm going to look at a couple of things to do with that, including an upcoming Joy Baker Day, some practical things you can do, like the Not Back to School picnics. And I'm going to look at the research, both the research gaps that we've got, and also talk about engaging in research and how that can actually drive the changes in perceptions around home education. So the first thing that seems important worldwide when we look at how other countries have changed perceptions around home education is understanding how home education is perceived. So the first thing to do, it can be really useful to, I know we've already had a talk about this, but I'm going to cover it very briefly, is contacting your local MP or councillor to talk to them about how they perceive home education, because these are the people that actually represent us at a national level in government. And so it's really important to begin with understanding their perceptions of home education. This was something that was really utilised when I spoke to some jurisdictions, some groups in different jurisdictions in Australia, where they actually actively engaged with their local MPs and councillors. They invited them to groups where it was appropriate. I think we're all under no illusion. Sometimes you'll contact them and they will be absolutely anti-home education and won't want to know, but there will be a great deal who are curious and willing to come and speak to you, chat to the children if you want them to, and really try and understand a little bit more about what home education is and what it means to you. And that can be really important because, especially when we have examples like this, where we have these, whether it's MPs or councillors, when they ask questions in Parliament, actually we want them to be relevant to us. So that's where the engagement can be really important. Some of the other things that can be really useful is including adults in local groups. So one of the things I found in a few other countries was that they actively included adults who'd been home educated, as well as parents who've home educated their children, and now those children are grown up. Or sometimes they've gone into the school system, but those parents and those adults have really valuable experiences. Plus, they tend to feel a lot less vulnerable than those of us who still home educating our children. There's a sense that if they put their head above the parapet and they speak out, actually there's less risk for them because they don't feel that same vulnerability because they're not currently home educating. So they can be a really useful tool for us as a community in terms of advocating for ourselves and each other. And then there's other things about engaging with the local community. So a lot of the groups I spoke to actually found a great deal of support when they engaged with local providers, for example. So in Devon and Cornwall, we've really utilised the Children's University as an example of that. And I can give a link to that at the end. So some universities have a scheme called the Children's University, and home educators can sign up to that. Plymouth and Bristol, I think, are really good examples. And children can celebrate all the activities they do and get acknowledged for that, as well as when you engage with local providers, whether it's a sports provider, a dance group, or a football club, and those children and engage with those providers, and actually that extends the view of home education within the community as something positive, as being active, and actually helps dispel the myths that home educators sit at home and are isolated. So when you have other members of the community able to talk about home educated children who are in their groups that actually are really well socialized and hopefully well behaved or well mannered, that goes a long way in changing the perceptions around home education. Okay. So calling out our challenging media where you see articles or programs and you disagree with the content. It can be useful to point to research that already exists. And I will come back to that point later. But when we have articles in the media, whether that's your local paper or national papers, and writing in or doing formal complaints to actually raise where you disagree with the way they've talked about home education can be really valuable in ensuring that we try and change the narrative, or at least try and challenge where the narrative is not really aligned with how we see home education. The other thing that can be really useful, I've found from different groups around the world, is engaging with your neighbours. And by that, I mean, for us in the UK, that would mean looking at different groups where we've got our local home education groups. Look at your neighbours, look who the next LA is, look who the next local authority is. And did that group have a better relationship, or do they think their local authority is doing better for home education? Are they doing worse? Can you help each other in what's worked in trying to engage with your local authority to make it perhaps less anti-home ed or more positive? So that can be really useful. One thing I think that really struck me when I spoke to home educating groups around the world was that there was a much stronger notion that they had to stand together as home educators. And a lot of them actually commented, which really surprised me. A lot of them commented to say, oh yeah, well we've got this national group, or we have this group, or we did this together, but you know, in the UK you're not too good at that. And it really surprised me that the common perception about home educators in the UK is that we didn't stick together. And I think that's something that maybe need to talk and tackle as a group of communities, that the one thing we all have in common is that we home educate. And really, it doesn't matter how differently we do it. The fact that we all choose to home educate is a really good, strong point for us to stand together to make sure that we continue to have the right to do that. And the final one is knowledge exchange and finding allies. So I recently spoke to, it's a good example. I recently spoke to the United Nations Rights to the Child group, and I spoke to the department that does the Rights Respecting Award in schools. And I spoke to them about a possibility of home educators doing our own version. And it took a year of engagement, but they were finally ended up being quite receptive to the idea that home educators could, in fact, be really good at meeting the rights of the child. And when I actually got to speak to them, like face to face or over Zoom, kind of face to face, and they got to ask questions about home education and kind of tried to challenge me on where home education might not meet any rights of the child, they were really surprised about the lived experience of myself and the groups that I was aware of, and how we do actually take into account our children's needs and their views. And they were actually really engaged then, and we saw it as a knowledge exchange. And I think that's really important, rather than us being defensive or angry, which I understand a lot of the time we do feel angry about things, but actually to see things as a knowledge exchange can be a really useful way of gaining allies and changing people's perceptions around home education. Okay, so practical things you can do to help change the narrative around home education and help make it see as something more positive. You can take part in research. There is always some research going on in home education. The two that I'm aware of at the moment is there is one that I'm doing through Exeter University, which is to do with the exam cancellations and the impact on home educators. I've engaged with Ofqual, and they, for the first time, have decided, with some support from me, to extend their Youth Voice project to make sure they're including home educators as part of that when they're looking at exam cancellations. So if you've got a child who has been through exam cancellations, there is an eligibility criteria. They have to be 16 plus, but that's really important to engage with, because things like the Ofqual research will have a direct impact on policy making. There is a Facebook page called LA's Behaving Badly. I'll share this slide so people can join it. There's an Alliance action group for people who want to see what other actions they can take part in. You can arrange a not back to school picnic. They're really good for engaging other local people who are thinking about home education but not really sure. There is a national day for Joy Baker for home education coming up in November, and I'm sure there'll be more about that on the Facebook groups. There is a new group called HECA, which is the Home Education Qualifications Alliance. If you've got a child of any age who's gone through the exams or exam cancellations and been impacted by that, then I would encourage you to join that. There's Education Otherwise, which is a charity for home educators. And there's the Centre for Personalised Education, another charity for alternative education. So they're practical things you can do. And then I just wanted to share a couple of examples before we go into the discussion about how research can help change a narrative. Because one of the things I found when I first started doing research into home education is that lots of families were really reluctant to engage. So I think it might be helpful to understand how helpful research can be in changing the narrative around home education. So one of the pieces of research that I've done recently, along with some support from Wendy and from Alison, is a review of the serious case reviews where home education has been tagged. And more importantly, where it's been tagged incorrectly. So when we think about policymakers and people making decisions around home education, as well as a lot of the features we see in the media, we often get these discussions around the serious case reviews. So on the NSPCC, you have a list or a library of serious case reviews, and the serious case reviews are cases that have been written up by different safeguarding boards from different local authorities, and that's usually where a child has died or been harmed, seriously harmed. So there are 1,532 searchable serious case reviews I found in the library. There was a total of 35 that were tagged as home education or home educating. When I actually reviewed each of these cases, we found that there were 21 where home education did in fact take place, but there were 14 of those cases where no home education took place at all. And I think that's really important that we can do research like this that actually shows that the number of home education, the number of tags of home education in these actually points to a skewing of the data. And it's really important to tackle issues like this and make sure that we can actually have an accurate reflection of where home education is involved in these serious case reviews and where it's not. There's a list of the 21 cases that do include home education. And I would say of these, some of them were as little as 4 months of home education, and the longest, most of them were under a year. There was a couple. There is a handful. I think there's 3 where they were long-term home educated, but the majority of these children had been in school. And these are a list again. I'm happy to share these. There's a list of the cases that didn't feature home education at all. So some of these were babies, not even of compulsory school age. Some of them were excluded, so excluded from school, no mention of home education. And some of them were receiving education provided for and funded by the local authority. So the responsibility for that education was on the local authority still, and not elective home education where the parents take in full responsibility for the provision of home education. So there's a really important distinction there. And what was apparent when we look at the when we look at the serious case reviews and the way that they're tagged, what became really apparent was that the people who are writing the reports for the serious case reviews, as well as the people doing the tagging at the NSPCC library, there seemed to be a confusion over what actually warranted it being home education and not, and what was a child just missing education or out of education or excluded. And I think this blurring of the lines in part contributes to the conflation we've got at the moment between home education and safeguarding issues. So in those serious case reviews where home education was tagged correctly, so there was a period of home education, the themes that came out of that were actually themes that speak to all of the serious case reviews, and they weren't exclusive to the home education cases. You would find these themes in all of the serious case reviews, and home education did not seem to be a factor or an influence in that child's death or serious harm. So the outcome of this current research was that there was seemed to be a confusion over whether there was elective home education, or whether it was a child missing education, or whether it was an EOTAS provision, so provided for and funded by the local authority. The findings of this research point to systematic level failures, and that home education was not a key factor in any of those cases. So the main concern is that the NSPCC were actually, we feel, wrong in how they framed their research. And so the conclusions that they arrived at actually weren't rooted in the evidence within the cases. The other piece of research that we're doing at the moment is local authority audit, looking at job descriptions, roles and responsibilities. We found that there was a variation from jobs looking for qualified teachers or people who've experienced in social care work, with the minimum being a requirement of a grade A to C in maths and English, with desirable but not essential work experience with children. So there was a huge variation in what local authorities were looking for in a home education welfare officer who's supposed to be there to judge the suitability of education. I also looked at the number of children who received an EHCP while they were home educating, and the number was incredibly low. Most areas had 0, with the most of them having under 5 children receiving an EHCP whilst home educating. The other thing that we found really interesting was that the services and provisions that local authority provided for home education was incredibly low. The majority of local authorities provided signposting, which was the extent of their support, but some actually commented that they didn't provide any at all. So just to confirm, if you did want to take part in any research at the moment, there is the Ofqual Youth Voice, which is looking at the experience of exam cancellations. If your child is 16 or over, so up to early 20s, so looking at school leavers and college age, you can take part in the Ofqual research. If you've got a child who's 14 plus and they've been impacted by the exam cancellations, you can do the research through the University of Exeter. For both of those, if you email me on this email, again, I will put that in the chat later. And some people have said they're not sure what to ask, but they want to take part. So I would just say, please, can you tell me about, and then either the Ofqual Youth Voice or the Exeter research. As a result of doing my own research, as well as engaging with different academics and home education groups worldwide, I've realized that there is actually a need for centralizing a lot of the research that exists around home education. So there will be in the works, it's coming soon, a new Centre for Elective Home Education Research. There is an international centre, but this one is to be focused specifically on UK-based research. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to actually come to the question in the chat next, because somebody actually asked a really great question. Neil, let me bring up the right page. Neil asked, Now, most UK parents are familiar with homeschooling and many struggle to cope. Do you think it better to explain the freedom you can have in home educating without the rigid timetable? Many would now recognise at least some positives in their involvement with their children. So should we engage more with all parents on that level, or a level at least that they're familiar with? I think that's a really great question. And I think one of the interesting things I've found, and again, this comes back to this change in the perceptions around home education. The Office for National Statistics actually did do a survey in the pandemic around how home educators were, how parents were schooling at home and found that experience. And actually, the research suggested that a lot of the families actually had a positive experience, which was really contrary to what we saw in the media. A lot of parents reported, the majority of parents that they questioned or took part in the survey said that they actually felt they coped really well, and that they enjoyed having their children at home. So, but I think in terms of your question, I think it is really important to engage with people about their experiences, and I think it can be really useful both for them as well as for the wider kind of aim of changing the perceptions around home education, to talk about the differences that you feel there are in your experience of home education than perhaps they might have had schooling at home during the pandemic. Okay, I don't know if there's any more questions.
I'm going to open up to gallery view because at the moment I think is Alison off for the weekend? I'm not, anyway, I don't know, but
maybe.
I can't remember if she was if it was this weekend or something. She was going away last weekend, maybe. So you've got Wendy here, and basically, so let me just spotlight you and Wendy, and then you guys can have a little chat. And if anyone else wants to join in, I mean, Rachel, you might want to join in with this chat. So we're talking basically about the perceptions people have of home education. Now that obviously plays a role in our battles with trying to make sure that we keep our rights and our freedoms and our responsibilities, that those continue to be recognized in a way that allows parents freedom to choose. But the perceptions that keep getting put out are so negative, and we actually have, there's a need for a PR campaign on our part to kind of to really work. It's a shame that we have to work this hard, because we shouldn't have to. The evidence is out there. Everything they need to know is out there. But unfortunately, this is where we are, where we kind of finding we're going to have to constantly work very hard to change perceptions. So let's talk a little bit about that. Wendy, what are your thoughts following the presentation?
There are two aspects to how you put out a more positive view of home education. One is the ground up and one is the top down. And you find on the ground that people in the UK particularly will be quite parochial. They don't want to meet with their local authority. They don't want to join in with a neighbouring group. They want to keep their local ideas very localized. And this is something that Jo touched on. And we need to break that. We need to start to think more widely, because everything that happens to your neighbour will happen at some point to you. So I think people need to be more open to inviting their neighbours into their understanding. And you look at it from the top down. Education otherwise very much works in the top areas. Jo's been working with us on several things. And by that I mean that we openly approach organisations, and it can take years. I actually had a meeting yesterday that took over 10 years to be agreed, but we keep battering at it. And if you're meeting with those who are creating policy, such as the local safeguarding board's review panel, who Jo met with us, and people like the Children's Commissioner, the DFE, the Ofqual, even with those who people perceive as your enemy, what you are doing is instead of hiding from them and allowing them to treat you as your enemy, you're going to them and saying, look, hello, we need to talk. And that approach is very effective. And And we have found some very positive steps being taken in the background because of that. And it works at local authority level and a lot of places too. People often refer to Lancashire as having really brilliant policy. Where did that come from? It came from home educators in the local area spending time and effort to go and negotiate with their local authority about how they behave. Likewise, Cambridge, it took years, but it happened. Likewise, Hampshire, those three are held up as good. Now, it doesn't always work, as Rahel, who's with us, can testify. It hasn't worked in Portsmouth, but in the majority of cases, people who are reasonable will accept that they gain more cooperation, and that's what they are looking for from home educating families, if they are willing to step toward those families and listen to them and try to take on board their concerns. So being fearful of communicating often makes our situation worse. It widens the divide and we need to close it.
I would say that's the benefit as well of including adults who've been home educated who are now grown-ups, and also those parents who, I affectionately refer to them as elders. They've been home educating 10 or 20 years, and their children are grown up. So unlike a lot of us who've got young children or children who are still compulsory school age, and you've kind of got that skin in the game where you've got that fear around. Lots of parents I speak to have a fear around being reported for one thing or another. Not that anything they're doing warrants being reported, but just that there's additional fear around that. So I think there's a great value to having these different kind of different people within the community as part of your local group, because they are far easier. They find it far easier and are better placed in some ways to actually take part in those negotiations and those conversations, because they don't face the same risks as you do when you've got younger children.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Jo's just said. As a rather more than 20 years, I'm almost at double that experienced home educator. I know that there are things that I can say and do that perhaps a mum or dad who's home educating now might be nervous of doing. For example, approaching a local authority which is behaving rather badly. There are cases where doing that has resulted in problems for the parent. Whereas if I approach them and say, look, I'm having this issue referred to me and my advice is being sought, we need to address this. I know you've got a hard job to do, but this isn't helping. How can we, between us, work it out? Then there's no risk to me. Well, actually, one local authority decided to describe me as disreputable when I contacted them. But hey ho, it doesn't do me any harm. But by far the majority of people, any reasonable person wants to actually do their best. And we can't continue to see these people as our enemy. We've got to see them as people who simply lack understanding.
I think actually as well, when I did the local authority audit as part of the research, I did a random sample and I spoke to 12 different local authorities. And I think what becomes really obvious, and I think that part of doing this actually changed my perception around the local authorities, from originally being a home educator and seeing local authorities as potentially the enemy, a threat, a genuine threat to what I was trying to do and the way I wanted to do it. And actually, it really, talking to the different local authorities as well as doing the audit, really helped me understand actually these are often individuals with no training. Their experience is often in social work or in teaching. So their perception of education, not even home education, but their perception of education is school. And when I've engaged with different local authorities, some are openly anti-home education, not interested, want every child back in school, but some are genuinely curious. Some are genuinely curious about why home educators don't want to engage with them, about what the issues are, about what they could do to support home educators. And there is a genuine with some of the local authorities, and they're actually just individuals at the end of the day. These are just individuals going to work, needing to do their job, and probably not quite sure what their job really is trying to do, because there's a great deal of confusion between looking at education, suitability of education, and safeguarding. And often there's a lot of pressure on education welfare officers for the safeguarding aspect, because nobody wants a serious case review on their door, but also, you know, on the suitability of education, because they see that as school. So there's a great deal of knowledge exchange needed there, and it's really useful to find out, you know, what level your local authority officer is at. Are they receptive? Are they interested? And are they sympathetic to what you're trying to do as an individuals and as a group, or are they not? And I think that's a really good starting point in trying to change the perceptions. We really need to understand for each of us at a local level what they are.
I'll also,
What,
sorry.
sorry, Rahel.
I'll also say that even though we're in Portsmouth, and as everyone knows, our local authority is really not receptive to any kind of communication, and we've tried, it doesn't mean that we've stopped trying, because staff changes and the politicians in charge change, and if we win this judicial review, then we will still have to work with the local authority. It will still be the same local authority, and we need to lay the foundations for future possibilities of communication. So we have been engaging with people learning to be councillors. In the last elections, we have been engaging with the MPs. Yeah, and we've gotten really good response from the media, actually, around the judicial review, and a lot of community support.
Well, picking up again on that point, as Rahel says, these are people who lack understanding. There may be some animosity there, and certainly in Portsmouth there is, but staff change. And an important thing that comes across to me is I often get people saying to me that their particular home education officer has got it in for them, or hates them, or is picking on them, or is targeting them. Do you know, it's not right. These are people who are going there, they're doing their jobs. They don't necessarily know how to do their jobs because they've had no training. They don't necessarily know what's expected of them. They've got managers putting pressure on them. They've got their own problems at home, and they're just trying to do a job. And one of the ways that, my apologies for the background noise, one of the ways that I try to persuade people to approach their local home education staff is by thinking in terms of what's in it for them. So you know what's in it for you, you know what you want, but what do they want from you? Because people respond much better to you trying to address their needs than just demanding that they address yours. I apologise for the background noise. When I go to speak to education officers in various different local authorities, one of the first things they do is start with rather heated voices, talking to me as if I'm there to challenge them and telling me how hard their job is. And the first thing I do is I say, I know, I understand your difficulties, but we've got to work with what we've got, and we have to work together. So let's take it from there. Tell them what's in it for them.
Yeah, perhaps I can share a little bit. So, you know, I know we also need to look at the big picture, but if we can bring our local authorities on side, it's very important, because they also are feeding back information. If we can get them looking at home educators more favorably. And I mean, Wendy, you know, I've worked with our local authority here in Coventry, and the way we approach it was they weren't too bad. They were kind of like middle of the road kind of local authorities. Their letters were sometimes annoying, where they didn't use the correct terminology and that kind of thing. And one of my friends, who was a teacher before she home educated, she had always been known to the local authority and worked with them, and fortunately had a fairly good relationship with them. And she invited me and set up a meeting with them. Now, one of the advantages is, first of all, both of us are older mums with older children. The other thing is that she's actually got a teaching background. I've got a social work background. Now, as much as, you know, it shouldn't be that way, they should listen to and respect anyone. If you're going to pick somebody to go and speak to the local authority, it almost has to be someone where they cannot talk down to you. They cannot put you, they have to regard you as an equal. And then hopefully you can kind of educate them to treat others equal as well, because sometimes there's that culture there's a culture in these sort of council departments, you find it in hospitals and so on, which is quite patronizing. You know, the whole where they're talking down and, you know, like, oh, just pop yourself up on the bed and just pop your top off and pop this and pop that, you know, and they can't talk to you like you're an adult. But it's something something there that they kind of like, it's supposed to be where they're trying to calm you down, but sometimes you don't need calming down, you just need some straight talking. So anyway, so the two of us went and we said, look, you know, we want to really just help the relationship between home educators. And what we said is, you know, ultimately what people want is to be respected. And just like you, when you go to somebody's house, or you go and call on someone or write a letter, you want them to respect you. We want to be respected. So we have to start on that basis of mutual respect. And if you want people to deal with you, you need to treat them as if they're as equals, not as if they're as equals. You have to treat them as equals. You need to understand that if you were in your home and somebody just came knocking on your door, that you might not like it, that you might feel threatened. Put yourself in the position. And so we kind of brought them around gradually, where they kind of like, you know, and sort of saying to them, you know, these are just parents who some of them never set out. They never set out to home educate. They wanted their child to have a great experience, and but they don't feel they've got a choice because their child is being let down. So you bring all of these different perspectives in where they've not thought about before. You know, this is not just some bloody-minded parent who's trying to, like, you know, give gestures to the local authority. So I'm too polite, so I won't use the other words. But it's, and the other thing is also that for them to, and the other thing that I made a joke with, but this is how they need to, they haven't thought of this, it hasn't occurred to them. I said to them, I have no interest in my children living off me at the age of 35. Surely you think it's in my interests to make sure they are educated and they get a job. And so you kind of need to get them into that, like, oh yeah, as a parent we are, and hopefully they are a parent. If they're not, you know, it's like harder sometimes, but just to kind of realize we are also just people. I mean, Wendy, you're saying they're just people who've got a job. We're also just people who's trying to be parents, trying to do the right thing for our children. And they benefit far more from coming alongside you, finding out what your needs are, and finding and seeing how they can plug those gaps for you. And so, but which worked at changing the culture of that office. So we got it right with the person who was then in the position. She allowed us to help her sort of make suggestions on the website wording and the letters and their lovely forms, you know, and what we and agreed that people don't have to fill in the forms, and, you know, had a whole conversation around that, and that was all agreeable. Then they appointed a new person in post. The post was like empty for months, as these things. She came in, set up a meeting with her as soon as she came in. Fortunately, the culture from the previous person had kind of filtered down, had a meeting with this lady. She even borrowed a couple of books on home education. We kind of just really gave her lots of information on different things. And she was great, no problems. And then she went off to have a baby. And another young woman came in, set up a meeting, same thing. And we've actually got quite a comfortable situation here in Coventry. And the local authority has an easy job, because she's being respectful, she's keeping and observing the boundaries, and doing what she lawfully can do, not pushing herself into anyone's houses without them wanting her there. And you know, I assume she's keeping an eye if she thinks there is a problem, but she's made her own life easier and less stressful by actually and she sends people to me. You know, I'll send her information about this conference, and I'll say, do you want to pass this on to any of the families you're working with? And it's, if you can have somebody like that sort of in my stage that is prepared to kind of help and navigate that, you know, and we can gradually maybe start working LA by LA, re-educating them, and learning from each other and helping one another with that, you know, the process that we followed. I know not all local authorities are open for that. I don't think Portsmouth are particularly open, but we've got to try and win them over one by one.
I think healthy boundaries, I'll let you come in, Wendy, but I think I'll come back to that point on healthy boundaries. Did you want to jump in there, Wendy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it doesn't just work at local authority level. Juliet referred to having somebody there who they can respect. You shouldn't need to do that. But when we go in at a high level, when they think they're talking to just a parent, the respect isn't quite as great, and that you're not received with quite so much, not just respect, but what you say isn't listened to quite so thoroughly. Whereas if you go there, if you happen to talk rather as I do, that immediately is a tick box in the you are to be respected, because it's thought to mean that you're more intelligent.
You use big words, Wendy.
Yes, I know I use big words, but apart from that, it's also if you're qualified, if you're coming from a university, or you're coming from an organisation, or you're coming from a great deal of experience, if you've got something which they can hang their respect on, it makes it easier for them. So as Juliet goes to them as a qualified social worker, an older mother with experience, or Jo goes to them as an academic working in the field, then it can open the door. So having one of the I shall say older, not aged, an older, more experienced home educator, former home educator with you, can tick that box for you.
And I think that's important at all levels, actually. And I think this is where it comes back to healthy boundaries. And I think there's a couple of things that are shown from my research as well as worldwide research, is that it's really important when you are engaging with local authorities, I think, in support of each other, to remind them that you're not the only group of home educators. If they're talking to you and a group of, we tend to be in little groups. I don't think we're one big community, we're communities, we're smaller groups of home educators. And I think it's really important to remind them, if you are engaging with a local authority, that there are other people who are going to home educate differently to you and who are going to want different things. And it's really important that we all advocate to retain the complexity of home education and the different ways we all do it, so that we don't get a one size fits all. Because I think that's part of what we need to do to advocate for each other, is say, well, actually, this is what we're interested in. This is what the group that we're coming to you as are interested in, but that's not the extent of it. There are other communities in this area who would want something different, and we encourage you to engage with them as well. So really important to encourage this idea of retaining the complexity of home education, and the different types of families that home educate, and the different ways that we do that. I think that's really important to maintain those healthy boundaries, and make sure that we're not narrow in the field of what's is seen as home education, and what's accepted as home education. And I think as well, on the advocacy, for those families who are engaging, voluntary or involuntary, with the local authority, and if you're due to have a visit, or you choose a visit, get somebody else who can act as that advocacy role to come with you. This was something that was employed in Australia, when they had in 2014, Australia went through a similar to we have. They went through an education committee where they reviewed home education. In Australia, they then had imposed monitoring and registration, and imposed standards of the curriculum, which they didn't have before. And one of the things that they used as part of their toolkit, if you like, was advocacy work. So they'd have another home educator who, if someone had a visit, they'd have another home educator who wasn't involved in that family, who wasn't part of the family, to come in and be present. And I think that for them, it went a really long way. One, in having somebody there who isn't emotionally involved in that visit, to maintain a professional distance for that family, so that they can step in if the local authority person is perhaps not obviously clear on the home education legislation. And also, I think there is a role here for, if you like, educating the local authority officer on the rules and legislation around home education, because it's something that I definitely came across, is that they weren't all actually correct in what they thought was their jurisdiction, if you like, in what they could or couldn't ask for from home educators. So again, having a second person there, if anyone is doing it, is really, really useful, and something that I know other countries have used as part of their work. And also, and on the changes in jobs and people doing the job of home education officer, apply for those jobs. There is enough home educators with the right qualifications to apply for those jobs. And in Australia, Tasmania is a really good example where their home education people, the officers that come in and assess the home education for the government, are all home educators. And in Australia, the average ratio of home educated children to school children is somewhere between 2 and 4% of the population, except in Tasmania, where it's home educated, run and led, where it's 12%. Massive difference. So, you know, if you do see a job for the local home education officer, get someone in the community to apply for it.
Yeah, Jo, there's some comments in the chat you might want to take a look
Okay.
at.
Yeah, Ruth said, I'm only just feeling confident to put my head above the parapet now my 3 are at uni. Yeah, absolutely. You're in the safe zone now. They've flown the nest-ish and they're deemed successful in academics. Yeah. But we really need people who are in that position, who've got that lived experience to bring to the situation and can help do those, you know, more, I guess, worrisome roles of the engagement and speaking out. Alice.
It's actually really lovely what Jo's just said. I didn't actually push myself forward a lot until my grandson was at the stage, who was the last one I fully home educated, was at the stage where he was better qualified than our local home education officer, which meant that nobody could touch me.
I see Joanna's got her hand up. I'll add her to I'll spotlight her quickly.
I was just thinking that we should just have a welcome package for all these newbies, you know, complete with links to documentaries and bibliography. And this is who we are, by the way. We're not invisible.
Sorry. Oh, I'm fiddling all over the place here and doing the wrong thing. Hold on. Sorry. Carry on, please.
Wouldn't this be efficient, you know, if we had a welcome package to hand in to whoever's recruiting and say, you know, these are your experts. They'll be here to help you in
with
your
the with the being and becoming DVD in the welcome pack.
Yeah, that's a bit
or something along those lines. We'll make a new one.
We actually designed the flyer. It was just before everything went bad with Portsmouth City Council, so we never printed those flyers. But we actually designed flyers to give out. Maybe we'll go back to it if things calm down.
Yeah, in a sense, explaining all the shades and variations in home ed.
Just kind of something to give when someone asks, you know, to leave. We have a lot of Navy people in Portsmouth, and someone, you know, the office for the families there, because people come and go a lot, asked for our contact details. We could have left some flyers with her, you know, things like that.
I did try and organize a little mini conference for the local authorities in the area. I was working through my local authority and asking her to contact others sort of in the surrounding area to see, but I think that was kind of just on the cusp of COVID and kind of everything got a bit tossed under the bus then. But I think that would also be another way to go, is if you've got the confidence to kind of do something like that. Wendy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things, when we rehashed Education Otherwise in the last year, we've replaced our website. And one of the things we were really, really keen to do is to make sure that it was accessible and that it covered all of the questions that new to home educating parents ask. So if you've got somebody in your area who wants to know what's what, direct them there, please do. Please feel free to print anything off. We've got starting out, we've got information for experienced people, we've got how to write an education report, how to deregister. It's all legally accurate. Use it for your packs if you want to. Print it off, share it, use it, because don't reinvent the wheel. We've done it. It's checked. It's legally accurate. It's great stuff.
Yeah, I think that's it's actually really important, because I think there is I mean, education otherwise are the obvious go-to for new home educators, and I know some of the local authorities actually mention education otherwise on their website. So there's a signposting. And I think there are the other thing I found when dealing with the local authorities for the audit was that there actually are some really good examples where local groups have engaged with the local authority and said, do you know what, when somebody's new, send them here. And they won't display all of the groups they do, and I'm not advocating doing that, because I know that there can be some safety issues with that. But if there is one meetup that you can suggest that the new families come to, or even a point of contact, you know, and this is where the home education elders can come in, you know, is there a point of contact that for new families coming in that you can direct them to, and then you can tell those families what's going on in the area. And having, you know, most of us have got Facebook pages for our local authorities or for the areas we live in, and having those up to date with just, you know, even if you do it 6 monthly or yearly, a list of all the activities that are going on, a list of all the groups that are going on, so that it's there for families who want to engage, and offering, you know, having within in-house, if you like, offering to go and meet that family, or somebody offering who's got kids of similar age, or, you know, one of the elders who's not got kids anymore, to come along and bring them to a group is really, really valuable. And I think that helps as well. I know one of the things I know that worked in some local authorities was that the local authority would contact one of the main points of contact and say, this family's new in, have they made it to any groups? And that person wouldn't give anything away. They would just say, yes, they've made it, and they're fine, they're confident, and, you know, we don't think there's anything wrong. And occasionally they would say, give the feedback that actually, you know, this family, we haven't seen them, sorry, we don't know who they are. And then that local authority, as I understand it, would then follow up and see if they needed any support. Or they would say, actually, we have met them and we're quite worried, and we think they need a lot of support, or there's something not quite right. And then that can trigger a different reaction. But I think that point of contact is really useful. One, for, I think, promoting that home education is inclusive, and that families are socialized, and that there is groups and things you can attend, and that can definitely help change perceptions around home education. But I think it's also a good way of highlighting when somebody does need support and having a way to do that.
I just want to go back to this changing perceptions thing as well. In our communities. Now, if some of you want to go back, and if you didn't catch Brittany Lopez Burton's talk, good to go back, because she speaks about change, like working within your own community as a home educating family. How can you engage more and be out there more, and actually affect the perceptions of those, like your neighbors? And she was doing things like organizing clothing swaps in the area, but, you know, for all the children. And during COVID, they were putting on plays, and, you know, lots of little things that she did that she talks about in her presentation, which it's, if that's all you can do, if you are not able to go and change your local authority and talk to your MP, just think about changing the perceptions of those right in your own backyard. Because we need to just have more people doing that to get those ripples out there, and hopefully all touching at some point. And another thing is, like, we had a family in our group a few years ago where their little girl, somehow they were living in a van, or like a little, they were trying something different. But I've known the family for some years, and they've got their quirks, but, you know, there's no real, I mean, I wouldn't, you know, nothing really to concern yourself. But so they were parked in their van on somebody's property. Somebody had let them park, and so they had access to toilets and bathrooms and everything in the building and whatever. But it was on a busy road, and the little girl got out one day and went walking along the road without the parents noticing, and so the child was picked up. And basically, you know, the social services got involved and came to see them. I don't think they were too worried about their living. I think they were fairly happy with the living situation, but they needed to speak to somebody, so they used me. They gave them my name. So when the social worker rang me, you know, my way of dealing with it was actually just because I've known the family for years, and I know who they are. I know who they are as parents. I know they care about their children, and they've done some amazing things with their children. And I've seen these children growing from babies. And my approach was just a very much, well, there's nothing to see here. You know, so they said, well, you know, would you say there's, you know, any difficulties? I said, well, you know, no more than most families, no more than most families. But, you know, I feel that they deal with it well, and they know where to go for support if they need it. So kind of just really just standing up for that family and pointing out, just, this is just normal stuff. This is not, there's nothing to see. There's no abuse happening. There's nothing, you know, we all had our once off. My little boy went walking down the road one day, and somebody came up and said, is this your child? Because we hadn't even noticed he'd gone, you know. It happens. You know, even these dads who've left their children in parked cars and forgotten it. It's horrible. It's horrible, but it's, you know, we've all had moments where we know, like, thank goodness nobody found out, because it's just life. And we can't, you don't need a whole family's lives ruined because of a momentary lapse, which they probably will never do again. It'll never happen again because they got such a fright. But yeah, so I think, you know, it is important, like, that we stand up for one another, as long as there's not genuine cause for concern. I think if there's genuine cause and we are worried ourselves, then we do need to speak up as well.
That's we can refer to David Cameron, of course, who left his child alone in a pub. So it does happen to everyone. But I was going to pick up on the point that Juliette's just touched on. One of the important things about being in contact with your local authority and trying to negotiate with your local authority is being able to actually contact them when something's going wrong. Somebody said earlier, nobody wants a serious case review in their local authority area, but we don't want a serious case review either. So if we're concerned about a family, as home educating communities, we might want to offer help. We do offer help, but if that isn't enough and something more formal needs to be done, we need to feel confident to approach the local authority and say, look, I do have concerns about this family. This is what my concerns are, and I feel you ought to perhaps, you know, try to see if there's something you can do to help. That is not being a sneak or doing something bad. And another point picking up from Juliet, I apologise. And another, I'm in a meeting, I'll ring you back in a moment. Another point picking up from Juliet is that even if you change one mind and one heart, you're contributing. I used to go out in the community with my grandson, and nobody remembered my name. Everybody locally referred to me as Charlie's grandma, but they treated him as a possession of the community, as somebody important, because he was doing okay, he was doing well, he was a home educated child. Oh yes, we all know Charlie. And I can recall going to a meeting with an MP, and the meeting was something like 50 or 60 miles from my home. And I walked in and he said, have we met before? And I said, no. And he said, you're Charlie's grandma. And this chap had heard about my grandson in a roundabout way, sort of third or fourth hand. And I immediately was accepted because they knew I was Charlie's grandma, and Charlie was a valued possession of the community. And that can help build bridges. And I do apologise. I was supposed to have been left by 8 o'clock, and that was my chase-up call. Can I say thank you, everybody, for inviting me, and perhaps take my leave now?
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll excuse you.
I also wanted to go back to the point that Joe was making before about how you welcome new people into the community, because we put a lot of effort into it. And the reason we put a lot of effort into it is because we value the new members, and we think that that we need to, in order to create a strong community, we need to make space for them and integrate them into into the community. But what we discovered during the judicial review, interestingly, was that we had a lot of support in the wider community of non-home educating families because of the support we gave to those families who just used home education as an interim solution. So we had all of these families that came through our community, maybe just even once or twice, maybe for half a year, maybe for a year, and they were welcomed, and it wasn't a solution that worked for them, but they walked away knowing us and valuing us and feeling valued by us. And when the judicial review happened, we suddenly had all of these voices around us supporting us, and it was amazing.
I think that's actually a really important point. And I know from the research I did last year, and I think I've probably spoken to over 1,000 families about this now, is that, and I think, I tend to be brutally honest because I think that's much easier, where you are. And I think that there is, in some areas, there can be clickiness around groups. There can be some groups who are a little bit more, we're happy with who we are and we've known each other a long time. We don't really want any newcomers. And I would say that, first of all, just acknowledge it. Just acknowledge that if you are an established group and you don't, you're not accepting new members, officially or unofficially, I don't think it's a problem that we say that and acknowledge that, because, long-term relationships do build. But at the same time, I think we should also be encouraging and thinking about setting up, new group in your area. If there's not one that you're feeling a connection to, start up a new group. If you're feeling that there's maybe a bit of clickiness in the area, set up a new group. And I think we have to actually make sure that we're allowing each other to do that as well, and making space for all the new families that are coming in. In an ideal world, we'd welcome everybody, no matter how they do it and who they are, and we'd welcome everybody and be one big happy family. But I think the reality is sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think actually what we need to do is also just acknowledge that it's okay to have different groups. It's okay to have more than one group in one area. And it's okay for those different groups to engage with the local authority on their own terms. And I think that's really important. It comes back to this retaining the complexity of the situation. But yes, Rahel, I think absolutely, welcoming new families and welcoming those families who are temporarily home educating is just as important as welcoming those families that are long term.
Well, I do think we need to build strong communities.
Yes.
Really work very hard to build strong home ed communities.
And even if you do have your group of friends who you do things with, which is fair, it's really, really good to invest in at least a weekly meetup that is open to everyone and that is welcoming to everyone. And really invest in it. Really make sure you know who the new people are and go and say hello and, try to find someone to introduce them to, explain what's going on. It pays back.
Yeah.
Yuan has actually mentioned, like, what if we could partner with local schools? And I think that is going to be a very much, from one community to another, whether you can do that successfully or not is, it can be tricky, really, that one.
Yeah, and I think as well, something that I haven't mentioned yet, that I think is actually probably really important, is that I think we all have to be aware when we talk about like strategies for changing perceptions around home education, and a lot of the themes this week have been around the politics of home education. I think we all have to be really aware that that whatever we do with the local authority does have an impact on the rest of the group. And I think it's really important as well that when we, even when we think about broader issues around, the discussions that are happening at the moment at national level around monitoring and in a national register, that seems to be, a certainty in the way they're talking that's going to come in. I think we have to be really conscious of what we agree to. It comes back to these healthy boundaries. What we're prepared to accept might not be what everybody else is prepared to accept. And I think that comes back to, having discussions amongst your groups and thinking about the impact of what you're doing. And the knock-on effect that might have, because I think we're all probably not so naive, for example, to think that a registration is going to end at registration. So I think, as well, I think it's really important that we do have this sense of community if we can, locally especially, because the one thing we've all got in common is that we want to home educate, and I think that's something that we need to build on. I'm just going to jump to some things that have come up in the chat, because I know we've run over a little bit, so I'll be quick. One of the things that we can do is the youth voice. I think there's space for a national youth voice, And I think there is space for regional youth voices. So, you know, if you're in Coventry or Devon or Portsmouth, have a regional youth voice where your young people can have their own voice. And that often holds a really strong political sway well beyond what the adults will have. So, you know, if you haven't got one already, ask the kids if they're interested in having a youth council and set one up in your area. There are discussions at the moment about how we might create a national youth council for home educators, and whether we can bring some accreditation to that to make them to allow these kids to have some kind of access to you know, a formal acknowledgement that they've taken part in that will hopefully benefit them. But I think there is real space for that. So, you know, have those discussions. You know, do the kids want a local youth council, and, you know, are there families that are prepared to support the functioning of a national one? Alison said, you mentioned NSPCC and the UN. When you present the evidence that's counter to their assumptions, I can see how that would give an opening to a positive discussion. I had considered such organisations as a lost cause, but with clear research and positive discussion along the lines of how home ed feels the rights of the child, etc., perhaps we can even get them on board. Yeah, I think for me, what I discovered through the process of this academic journey I've gone on through home education is that understanding the fears that have triggered, if you like, the reports like the UN has written or NSPCC, understanding the underlying fear or causes of that, you know. And I think with the NSPCC, as well as when I've dealt with the Safeguarding Panel, for example, there is always a basic assumption born out of the fact that they've got no idea about home education, that we do it in isolation, you know, that there's a high level or risk of isolation in home education, that children are not well socialized because they don't see anyone because they're not at school. They had no notion, when I've spoken to various sort of government level departments, there was no notion that we do things as a community, that we do things in groups, that we do activities outside the home. So part of what I've been doing as an academic researcher is kind of trying to re-educate them around what home educators actually do and what it normally looks like. Because if you only ever read the serious case reviews on the NSPCC library, you would think that children are excluded from school, or they leave through school through self-harm or mental health issues, or they're on the verge of exclusion, or they've got serious health needs, and so they just do school at home and are isolated. It doesn't look anything like home education. But if that's your only experience of it, and for a lot of these departments it is, then you're not going to have any notion of what home education normally looks like. So part of my role with the academic route is bringing to them the research that shows them how different it looks, as well as pointing them to lived experience that it's vastly different to the perceptions they have of it. And with regards to the United Nations, again, you know, when they wrote their report, I mean, not only when you break down the text, but when you speak to them, it becomes really obvious that they actually are ex-teachers who are writing about this same group of children that they're aware of through things like the serious case review, where they're excluded from school or on the verge of exclusion or have school refusal or anxiety, which doesn't really represent the broader experience of home educators. And what they actually needed in order to change their perceptions of home education was an engagement of, well, look, this is actually loads of research on this, and look at what it says. And actually, did you know the lived experience of this group is very different to what you've said? And here's what it is. You know, we do things as a community, we do things in groups. Parents do this, you know, with the voice of the child at the forefront of their decisions. So they're definitely not all lost causes. You know, there will no doubt be some, you know, we can't be any under illusion that everyone's going to come on board. But I think there is definitely scope for a lot of these organizations to change their mind, especially with like the United Nations, if they think that home education fulfills the rights of the child. And the lady I spoke to, who was at the headquarters in London, actually said, when I went through with her examples of how my practice, for example, meets a lot of the United Nations rights of the child, and how I could envisage that as a group we could do the Rights Respecting Award, for example, she was really actually shocked and surprised how different it was from the report they'd written. And she said to me, do you know what, I actually expected you to be really angry about it, and I expected confrontation with this conversation. I didn't expect a knowledge exchange. And I said, well, that's really good. that you've seen things differently. And she said, if you actually could show us, through doing a pilot, that home educators actually do meet the rights of the child in the ways that you've said they do, you would be proving beyond any reasonable doubt that home educators are actually far better positioned to meet the rights of the child than any school ever could. Apart from saying,
doesn't
I
it
know.
bother you? But doesn't it bother you that they always put the onus on us to prove it instead of just, that bothers me. That so even with all the negative press, where they're actually not going to look and see what are the positives, and it's a real shame. It is a real shame that they kind of, I don't know, just persist in the narrative and the stereotypes and all of that.
It's discrimination. I'm not in any, I'm not messing with my words here. It is systematic discrimination. And there is a massive misconception around home education. And absolutely, Juliet, this home education is a legal right in the UK. It holds equal weight in law. You are free to make that decision, and you should not have to defend it. Schools don't have to defend it. We shouldn't have to defend that decision. And I think, we also shouldn't have to do our own advocacy in this. There's no representation for us at national level. There is no person who protects home education.
Well, we shouldn't have to parade our kids and say, look at all our success stories.
We shouldn't have to. We absolutely shouldn't have to do any of this.
But we do.
Being pragmatic.
I did say in the comments about the Meet the Home Educated videos, which I put up on the app with different young people that are home educated. And of course, I had the interview with Billy Arthur Walden this morning, who's been on George Clark's Amazing Spaces. It's just a lovely, lovely family, dead ordinary family, just normal like all of us. And, but yet the head teacher in that case was reported to social services saying this child sitting behind a computer all at the time. She phones the grandma, says, I know he's sitting at a computer all the time. That's all he's doing. Can I speak to the mother? And she said, well, actually, they're off at Hadrian's Wall at the moment. And it's such, but it's kind of, it's just, it is frustrating, but we do have this huge, big PR campaign on our hands.
When the lovely calendars were made at the beginning of this year, we sent one to our local MP, and he sent back a very appreciative letter where he wrote that he didn't realize that we did so much out of the house.
We shouldn't have to do
we
this,
did invite him. We did invite him to a meetup, but that was just before COVID. So
we absolutely shouldn't have to do this. We shouldn't have to fight so hard to defend what really is a right to be doing this in the first place. But I think the problem is just, being pragmatic. There is a great deal of misconception and misunderstanding around home education. There is a political rhetoric at the moment around children missing education, children hidden from education. And again, this is one of my bugbears. If we're being accurate, we should just say there are children who are on the home education register, or children who are registered at school, and there are children who are not. And there shouldn't be the drama and the emotive language around that actually acts to demonize home education. None of us have got hidden children. None of us have got invisible children. There's no wizards here.
I mean, let's face it, the arguments are not sensible when anyone who is reasonable, if they do the breakdown and if they are really interested in the truth, the arguments fall apart.
It's not about an argument, though. It's about a narrative. And we need to fill those spaces with different narratives. And it can't just be one narrative or two, because then you're the odd one out. You're that family, you're highly educated, so you're okay. Or you're a social worker, so you're okay. But those other ones aren't. So we need to fill with, the media and introduce politicians, introduce anyone we can to our communities. So they have more and more different narratives available to them.
And there was some good discussion last night on engaging with MPs and councillors in the media. That was a really good conversation. So that's a good one to go and watch as well. Now, we probably should start wrapping up, I guess. These conversations have been really good, and I've found them very fruitful, actually. And for those who are interested, tomorrow night, so we have the closing of the conference tomorrow afternoon, but tomorrow night, there's one last session. And the session tomorrow night is actually to come, so you can come and find out, how can I get involved? What can I do? Or to put in some ideas, so we can, some of us who are working with groups to try and look at how we help and how we fight back, we can direct you to places where you can help, or recruit you, or but we all need to be creating a greater awareness amongst home educators that things, we have to be a lot more proactive. We can't just assume everything is going to continue as it has for years. And if we want future generations to enjoy the same freedoms that we have, we are going to have to get a lot more active and be those champions out there for home education. So it's taking it a little further out and out of our comfort zones. But we're teaching our children by us being active in civil, getting civil, in civic, Brian Ray, what did he call it? But getting, just getting out there and being involved in society. We demonstrate things for our children so they learn, and it helps them as they grow as well. Anyway, it's been great. I don't know if anyone had any last questions or comments before we close this.
Oh, just going to pick up on Ayana's comment about working with local schools, and that definitely differs from area to area. But there are some really good examples of schools that are, especially the smaller schools, that are willing to do flexi schooling, and also schools that are willing to have local home educators do exams there and use them as an exam center, or do after school clubs with them. So I think it's worth engaging, but I think it does definitely differ from area to area. It differs from head teacher to head teacher.
Yeah.
But it's all like a testing ground, really.
There was a school that was basically saved from closure because they turned to flexi schooling, I think.
There was one in Staffordshire who did that. Yeah, for sure.
So, that's, there's still hope that we can, but I think we do all have to work that little bit harder to kind of just get that message out there, the positive messages out there.
I was going to share actually some really good advice that I was given. Was that you can't change the whole world, but you can change your bit of it. And I think if you can change things locally and make it better for other home educators locally in your area, then that's a brilliant start.
Great. Well, that's a good note to end on. So thank you very much to Jo for your preparation tonight, and to everyone for participating and sitting in and listening. We actually appreciate having you support us, because sitting here talking to nobody isn't fun either. So thank you very much.